Welcome to all of you. I'm Professor Christian Laas of the University of Manchester, and this trial lecture of mine is actually a story. I'd invite you to read together with me a small inscription. It's only 3 or 4 lines of Latin, and no worries, there will be translation for you. But I will actually show you how we, as ancient historians, try to sort of construct a whole story just based on a few lines. And I actually want to show you also how we manage to do this. So the title of my talk, the title of this trial lecture would be A Grandmother Taking Care of Small Children, What a Latin Inscription Can Tell Us. Welcome. My trip takes you to the city of Rome. And you might recognize the 2 international airports of Rome. So on the left, in the north, you see the Leonardo da Vinci International Airport. And also on the left, on your map, you see Fiumicino Airport. Now, when you start from Fiumicino and you go to the right, you encounter a place, a site which is called the Necropolis of Porto or Isola Sacra. Now, Porto, or Portus in Latin, was actually the main harbor of the city of Rome. And it's a beautiful site nowadays, beautiful archaeological site, and also a quiet one. If you would ever arrive in Fiumicino and you would have like half an hour, 1 hour left, I'd invite you just to take a bus, and the bus goes to Porto, and you will find an archaeological site which is hardly busy, so there's not too many people there, and there's beautiful things to see, things you might even recognize, because this, for instance, is a picture I took in Porto, and it's a picture that is actually often there in handbooks of Greek and Roman culture, also for secondary schools. This is a necropolis, so what you see here are actually all graves which are built like little temples. Also these images, also these pictures are quite famous. On the left, for instance, you find a depiction of a Roman calendar, while on the right above you have the famous relief depicting a midwife and actually also a woman giving birth, and for giving birth, Roman women used to sit on a chair, and this is actually what is being depicted here. So the midwife tries to sort of extract the baby out of the womb of the Roman mother. Now, it was during one of my trips to Porto, it was actually my first one, that I got a guided tour by a colleague from the University of Vienna in Austria, who is depicted here on the left. It's Professor Kurt Smolak. And when Smolak started his guided tour, he actually showed us one inscription which is placed nowadays at the entrance of the site. And this inscription immediately drew my attention. It's not only a beautiful one, but there was also a kind of phrasing, a kind of wording, which sounded very particular to me. So just have a look at the inscription here at the right, or at the photo I immediately took to have it in more detail. So it's in beautiful letters. It says Claudiae Beruti Aviae et Nutrici Suae. I'll deal with the text afterwards, but it's perhaps just beautiful to watch all these letters and the very elegant Roman capitals. As an ancient historian nowadays, you're lucky to have so many digital tools which can actually help you. So when I came home, I immediately did a search via a search engine, which is called the Manfred Claus database. And I searched for these words that I found so particular, namely the Aviae and the Nutrici. So I just did a search And lucky me, there was only one hit, an inscription from Fiumicino Portus, indeed the inscription I saw and the inscription you just saw on the photos. Now, let us just have a look at this inscription. What does it tell us? You can start from the English or from the Latin, whatever you want. Dies manibus. This means to the spirits of the departed. Claudiae Beruti aviae et nutrici suae dulcissime. This is the Latin for saying, for their most sweet grandmother and nurse. And then you have the names of the two people who actually set up the inscription. Tiberius Claudius Maximus and Claudia Matrona. Both were the grandchildren, her grandchildren, nepotes eius. And then it is said about the poor grandmother who had died, Melius Merenti. She had deserved better. Only some lines of Latin, but there's actually an intriguing story behind this. Just based on these very few lines, what can we know for sure? Well, first of all, that the combination avia nutrix, so grandmother and nurse, is almost unique. When you do a further search with the database, you will find one other instance, namely an inscription from, also in Italy, Verona. Also, her name, Berus, is kind of unique. You won't often find it, and when you find it, it's always in connection with Egypt. So we might suppose that somewhere in the family of this grandmother, there was an Egyptian connection. Now, Romans mostly have three names. Their main name, or what we would call their surname, is the nomen gentilicium. Now, the nomen gentilicium of the grandmother is Claudia. Now, because of the fact that the two grandchildren are also called Claudius and Claudia, it is most likely that this grandmother was a paternal grandmother. Another thing, it is said about her that she had deserved better, which is in Latin, Melius Merenti. Now, this is, again, intriguing. Nearly all Roman inscriptions just have Bene Merenti. She deserved it well. But this says she deserved better, Melius Merenti. And again, out of thousands of gravestones we have, this is a unique formula. This is the only instance. And then one may ask, of course, avia nutrix, so grandmother and nurse, this is a very special combination. Would you find other things like mater nutrix, namely the mother nursing herself? Well, we have about 6 instances of this. And I just quote one example from the literary writer Varro, and he says, as to feeding their young, de nutricatu, hoc dico, I merely remark, that in most cases, they suckle them as well as bear them, easdem ferre et nutrices et matres. So, Varro is saying this about exotic people, about Illyrians, and he's not actually saying that this is the normal way things go. So for Romans, surely for aristocratic Romans, it was not always the case that it were actually the mothers who breastfed the children, it were often nurses. And so the fact that the mother is also the nurse is quite a rare instance. Now, these are things we can just know for sure. There are other things that we may imagine as having happened in the case of this inscription. First of all, you should think about the missing family links. Mostly and regularly, when parents or children were still alive, they would have been mentioned on the inscription. Now here, we have two grandchildren, but their parents are not mentioned. This means that the children of this grandmother are not mentioned. There must be a reason for this. And the most likely reason is that these people were just not alive anymore. That it was just the grandmother being alive and recently died, and the grandchildren still surviving. It also means that she, the grandmother, in all likelihood was a widow already. If not, her husband would have been mentioned surely as dedicating the inscription. Now, how old would Claudia Berus have been? She's a grandmother. So was she old? Well, not necessarily. According to life tables, which you will learn how to use when you do my course on families in the Greek and Roman world, it actually was the case that about 4% of Roman women were grandmothers at the age of 40. 25% of them were grandmothers at the age of 45. So being a grandmother did not necessarily mean being old. On the other hand, when you start from the children themselves, the grandchildren themselves, I should say, it has been estimated that at age 10, only 16% of Roman children still had a paternal or their paternal grandmother alive. This grandmother would, on average, have been 67 years, well, 67 and a half years of age. At age 20, only 4% would still have had a paternal grandmother alive. She would have been approximately 75 years of age. And at age 30, only 1% of the Romans would still have their paternal grandmother alive. And she would, on average, have been 81.4 years of age, roughly. Now, what to say about this inscription? Since our two children, since Claudius Maximus and Claudia Matrona, in all likelihood did not have their parents alive anymore, there is a chance that they were rather about age 20, which would mean that their paternal grandmother, Claudia Berus, could have been something like 75 years of age. Now, is it possible that she, as a grandmother, had played an educational role? Absolutely yes. This is what is called in Latin literature the avia educatrix, or the grandmother as an educator. And you find instances of such grandmother as an educator in the literary records and in the epigraphic records. You also find it in the papyri from Greco-Roman Egypt, where there are some 15% of the families which are actually a so-called three-generational household. This means grandparents, parents, and grandchildren living together. There are telling cases of grandmothers taking care of their grandchildren. This is one of my favorites from the Roman first century writer Quintilian. Quintilian had a very unhappy family life himself. He lost his wife. He lost his son, who was only 5 years of age. They had another son, and this son lived up to the age of 10, and then he died too. Now, Quintilian is telling us the following about this child of his who had died. It was a further trick of fortune, meant to torment me even more, that this delightful child preferred me to his nurses, preferred me to the grandmother who brought him up. Here you have it. When you have a look at the Latin, it's again aviae educanti on the first line. Preferred me to all those who commonly win the affections of little children. There's more. The Emperor Vespasian is said to have been raised and educated by his paternal grandmother. And even when he, Vespasian, at older age, was an emperor himself, there still was, every single year, a sort of commemoration of the birthday of Vespasian's beloved grandmother. In the second half of the 4th century CE, Roman author Ausonius will write a poem or a collection of poems called the Parentalia, in which he basically commemorates all his family members, going from the nuclear family unit up to what we would call extended families. There again, his grandparents and his grandmother surely play an important role. Now, this is all interesting, at least I hope so, but I hope you would agree that educating children, even as a grandmother, is still quite different from breastfeeding your grandchildren. That sounds like a crazy idea, and that sounds even like something which is biologically just not possible. However, in the examples we have seen, it was clear already, when Romans use a term like nutrix, they actually think about the fact of breastfeeding. Now, can we imagine a grandmother breastfeeding? Well, actually, yes. There are quite some anthropological cases attesting this. This is not only with tribes in Africa or South of America, but it's a very common instance also in Europe up to at least the 19th century. When I once discussed this inscription with a colleague who was kind of fond of genealogy, he would tell me that in his family, in the 19th century, so he had been collecting facts about his family in the 19th century, that basically in his family there were cases like this too. So these were mothers having many children, continuing breastfeeding them, and then when the oldest child was a mother already, it was often that child's grandmother who sort of continued the breastfeeding. When you read medieval hagiography, so lives of the saints, this is actually something like a topos, a cliche almost. So what you read in these stories is sometimes the very cruel fact that the mother dies in childbirth, and then the father is left with the baby. And who has to breastfeed the baby? Sometimes the father just cannot afford a nurse, and then he will ask the child's grandmother to do so, and it is said that every now and then she actually could do so. Could you imagine that in France, up to the end of the 18th century, there were men who were called tétailleurs? Now, what was the job of these tétailleurs? It was actually to suckle women's breasts in order to keep them stimulated for the case that there would be a necessity for them to breastfeed new children, children from other families or children from their own family. And medical inquiries would actually say that once a woman is breastfeeding and once her breast keep on being stimulated, she can do so for a very long period of time. So, of course, a grandmother breastfeeding sounds absurd to us when we hear this for the first time, but when we look a bit deeper into the evidence, and when we dare to be comparative in our approach, we actually see that this is not as rare an instance as we thought it was. Let me just come to a conclusion. What I did was just offer you a few lines of Latin, just one very simple inscription. Now, what you will learn with us at the Department of Classics, Ancient History, Archaeology and Egyptology at the University of Manchester is actually to really deal with the sources and work with the sources yourself. And then you will see that when you study a small text like this, there are actually things we can really know for sure. Knowing that the combination Avia and Nutrix is a very rare one. This is a sure fact. Knowing that the name Berus has something to do with an Egyptian connection. Knowing that Melius Merenti is a very rare instance again. Knowing that these are actually the grandchildren who commemorate their grandmother. Other things are perhaps not so sure, but they are at least scenarios that we may rightfully imagine. For instance, we may imagine something about the age of Claudia Berus and the age of Claudia Matrona and Claudius Maximus. We may ask why certain family members were not mentioned. These are all things which are perhaps not sure, but we may rightfully imagine them. At the same time, we may ask questions about the educative role Claudia Berus must have played. And we may even imagine that there was more going on and that perhaps she was called specifically a Nutrix because she had even taken on this intimate task of breastfeeding her grandchildren. Now, of course, you don't need to agree with my last suggestion. And that's the nice thing, of course, of scholarship. There's always room also for disagreement and for just having a debate based on the texts and on the evidence. However that may be, I hope you'd agree that this tri-lecture has told you and has taught you something about being a grandmother in antiquity. And that it has taught you something about the possibility of growing up without your mother, growing up motherless in antiquity. Now, the remarkable thing is that about both these topics, which are so vital to understand life in the ancient world, no single monograph has been written. We're still waiting for a collective volume, which will be about growing up motherless in antiquity. This volume will be there in 1 year time, I guess. But we're still waiting for a good study about being grandmother in antiquity. So, if I may conclude this trial lecture with a very modest wish, it would be that I actually have just invited you to think about all these vital issues and perhaps to do research about them once, whenever you feel ready for it. Welcome at the University of Manchester.